There is a specific smell when a continent burns. It isn't just wood and concrete. It's ozone. It's melted copper. It's the sudden violent vaporization of 8 million lives, leaving a permanent bloody tang on the back of your tongue. They hit Earth, first thinking we'd break. Thinking a shattered spine meant a dead animal. They didn't understand that for humanity, grief isn't a paralysis. It's a propellant. This is how we made sure they never looked at our sky again. Denver used to have mountains. Now it just had edges. Jagged smoking lips of a crater that stretched so far the curvature of the earth seemed to swallow the opposite side. Arthur Cole stood at the precipice, his boots sinking into a layer of gray snow. It wasn't precipitation. It was pulverized concrete drywall and bone drifting down from the superheated stratosphere. It tasted like chalk. Every time he swallowed a gritty paste, coated his throat, making him gag. He didn't spit. Saliva was a commodity now. He pulled the collar of his surplus jacket tighter around his neck. The synthetic wool was scratchy, smelling faintly of the mothballs from whatever deep storage bunker it had been dragged out of. Below him, in the basin of the glassed city, the cleanup crews looked like bright yellow insects crawling over a corpse. They were looking for survivors. Arthur knew the math. There were none. The orbital land strikes hadn't just leveled the city. They had boiled the groundwater. Anyone who survived the blast had been flash-cooked in their own basement shelters. Major Cole. Arthur didn't turn around immediately. He watched a massive crawler crane shift a slab of fused highway, the diesel engine, grinding in a low, ugly mechanical groan. He liked that sound. It was human. It was noisy and inefficient, and it meant they were still breathing. Major, the voice repeated. It was Corporal Miller. She was young, maybe 22, but her eyes looked like they belonged to a 90-year-old hospice patient. The whites were threaded with angry red vessels from the particulate matter. Arthur finally turned. "What is it, Miller?" "Central Command needs the updated logistics report for Sector 4. And they brought in another transport from the Springs. Refugees." Arthur rubbed the bridge of his nose. His fingers came away black with soot. A dull, thudding ache pulsed behind his right eye. He hadn't slept in 70 hours. His body felt hollowed out, entirely detached from his brain, floating in a sea of adrenaline and bad coffee. "Where are we putting them?" he asked, his voice cracking. He coughed a dry, rattling sound. "We don't have tents, sir, or cots. We're putting them in the old rail yards, sleeping on the concrete." "It's freezing, Miller." "I know, sir." She looked down at her tablet. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the same vibrating, frantic terror that had gripped the entire species for the last 3 weeks. The invaders hadn't offered a manifesto. They hadn't broadcast a declaration of war or a list of demands. They simply dropped out of slipspace, massive angular ships that absorbed the light of the sun and started erasing population centers. London, Beijing, Kinshasa, Denver. Just methodical, cold extermination. By the time Earth's orbital defense network managed to blind fire a nuclear barrage that disabled 3 of their capital ships, the fleet had retreated back into the void, leaving behind 3 billion corpses and a planet choked in smoke. We called them the Reeve. It was short guttural, a name to spit out. Requisition, the shipping containers. Arthur said, his voice flat. He didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel a surging, defiant spirit of humanity. He just felt an exhausted mechanical need to fix the immediate problem. Cut vents in the sides with plasma torches. Haul in whatever insulated cabling we have left from the telecom warehouses and string up radiant heaters. It'll smell like burning plastic, but it'll keep them from freezing to death." "Yes, sir." Miller hesitated. "Sir, the rumor from Geneva, is it true?" Arthur looked at her. He noticed the way her uniform hung loose on her frame, the way a smear of mud cut across her cheek. She was just a kid. Before this, she was probably worried about rent or a bad breakup or what to eat for dinner. Now she was managing the triage of a dying world. "Geneva is gone, Miller. There is no rumor." "Not about the city," she said quickly. "About the derelicts, the rive ships we shot down." Arthur shifted his weight. His left knee popped a sharp reminder of an old, torn meniscus. He looked back out over the crater. The smoke was thick today, painting the weak afternoon sun a bruised, sickly purple. "They're cracking the drives," Arthur said quietly. It wasn't a secret, not really, but saying it out loud felt like lifting a very heavy, very dangerous stone. The eggheads in the Nevada bunkers. They pried open the wreckage of the ship that crashed in the Atlantic, found out how their slip drives work. Miller's breath hitched. "Can we use it?" "We are using it," Arthur replied, a cold, dark satisfaction uncoiling in his gut. It was a vile feeling. He hated himself for the smirk that pulled at the corner of his chapped lips. "We aren't rebuilding the cities, Miller. Command issued the order an hour ago. Every ounce of steel, every drop of fuel, every able-bodied person, all of it goes to the orbital shipyards." Miller stared at him. "We're going after them." Arthur looked down at his grimy hands. He was a quartermaster, a pencil pusher, a man who spent his life counting boots and bullets. He wasn't a killer, but as he looked at the ash coating his skin, the ash of millions of his own kind, he realized that something fundamental inside him had broken. And in its place, something jagged and vicious had taken root. "We aren't just going after them, Corporal," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We're going to find out where they sleep, and we're going to burn their house down." 14 months later, high orbit over Luna, the smell of recycled air never quite lost its metallic tang. It smelled like sucking on a penny. Arthur sat in the cramped auxiliary control room of the Armstrong shipyards, staring at a holographic display that flickered with a faint blue light. The hum of the station's life support was a constant low-frequency vibration that rattled his teeth and gave him a perpetual migraine. He took a sip of his coffee. It was lukewarm and tasted mostly of burnt chicory. Real coffee beans were a memory now buried under the radioactive ash of South America. Through the thick, multi-layered permaglass of the observation window, the void of space was obscured by scaffolding. Millions of miles of it. It looked like a metal infection spreading across the face of the moon. And cradled within that scaffolding were the ships. They were hideous. Before the Rive human spacecraft had an elegance to them. Smooth lines spinning habitation rings, bright white holes designed to reflect solar radiation. They were vessels of exploration, built by a species that still believed the universe was a place of wonder. The ships Arthur was looking at now were blocks of blackened tungsten and depleted uranium. They had no windows, no habitation rings. They were essentially massive armored cylinders strapped to the reverse-engineered slip drives ripped from the alien wrecks. They bristled with kinetic bombardment cannons, railguns the size of skyscrapers that fired slugs of solid iron at relativistic speeds. They weren't ships. They were flying anvils. They were designed to take a beating break through an orbital blockade and drop rocks until whatever was beneath them stopped moving. We are 3% behind schedule on the Class 4 thruster assemblies for the Third Fleet. Arthur didn't look up from his datapad. He recognized the heavy dragging footsteps of General Reed long before the man spoke. Reed was a large man who seemed to be slowly deflating. His uniform was immaculate, but the skin around his neck was loose, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull. The supply chain from the Martian mines got held up by a solar flare. Arthur said, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat. We lost a transport, 300 men. They burned up in the upper atmosphere trying to break too late. Reed stood beside him, looking out the window at the ugly brutalist fleet. He didn't ask about the men. He didn't offer condolences. There was no room left for empathy. Empathy was a luxury of peacetime. Can you compensate? Reed asked. I can strip the plating off the decommissioned lunar habitats, Arthur replied, pulling up a new spreadsheet. The screen bathed his face in a sickly light. Melt down the bulkheads. We'll have to cram the displaced workers into the lower levels of Sector 8. It'll be tight. Disease vectors will spike. We might lose another 1,000 to respiratory infections if the scrubbers fail. Do it, Reed said instantly. Arthur paused. His fingers hovered over the glass surface of the tablet. A year ago, he would have argued. He would have talked about human rights, about minimum living standards. He would have yelled. Now he just felt a hollow fatigue. He tapped the screen authorizing the displacement of 50,000 people to melt down their homes for armor plating. Done, Arthur said. We jump in 4 days, Arthur, Reed said quietly. The general leaned his heavy hands on the console. The metal creaked under his weight. Navigation finally cracked the core memory of the command ship we dragged out of the Mariana Trench. We have their staging system coordinates. Arthur's stomach dropped. It wasn't fear exactly. It was vertigo. The culmination of 14 months of obsessive grinding planetary mobilization. Earth had starved herself. They had eaten synthetic protein paste and lived in the dark, pouring every volt of electricity and every drop of sweat into the shipyards. How many targets? Arthur asked. 3 primary worlds, Reed said. High gravity, dense atmosphere. Looks like industrial hub shipyards. Exactly what we need to cripple. Arthur finally looked at Reed. The general looked away, staring stubbornly at the black void beyond the scaffolding. Rules of engagement, Arthur asked. The words tasted like ash. Reed's jaw tightened. A muscle twitched in his cheek. He took a long, slow breath, the sound whistling through his nose. When he spoke, his voice was utterly devoid of inflection. Total kinetic saturation. We don't hail them. We don't target military installations. We drop out of slip space, we align the cannons, and we fire until the planetary crust fractures. We do not stop until the atmosphere burns off. Arthur stared at him. He felt a sudden violent urge to vomit. The acid of the terrible coffee churned in his gut. They were talking about xenocide, the complete erasure of billions of lives. He remembered the yellow cleanup crews in the Denver crater. He remembered the smell of ozone and burnt copper. He remembered Corporal Miller's shaking hands. General, Arthur started, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't know what he was going to say. A plea for restraint. A reminder of their humanity. Reed turned to him, his eyes dead and flat. They hit Earth first major. They rang the bell. We are just answering it. Make sure the magazines are fully loaded. Reed turned and walked away, his heavy boots clanking on the metal deck plates. Arthur sat alone in the humming silence of the control room. He looked down at his hands. They were clean now. He scrubbed them every night with harsh chemical soap until the skin cracked and bled. But no matter how hard he scrubbed, he still felt the chalky, gritty ash from the Denver crater embedded in his fingerprints. He turned back to the console. He pulled up the munitions manifest. He calculated the mass of the iron slugs. He ran the math on orbital velocity and planetary impact. He did the math of spite. He didn't weep for the Reeve. He wept for the Arthur Cole, who had died 14 months ago, and he signed the requisition forms to load the guns. The transition into slipspace felt like being turned inside out. Arthur gripped the edges of his crash couch, his knuckles turning white. The physical universe dissolved into a screaming non-Euclidean blur of ultraviolet light and crushing pressure. His ears popped a sharp pain, driving deep into his sinuses. The air in the command center of the dreadnought Wrath tasted suddenly of copper and sulfur. Next to him, a junior tactical officer gagged, ripping off his restraint harness just in time to vomit a stream of clear fluid onto the deck plating. The smell of bile instantly permeated the enclosed space. Arthur ignored it. He was focused entirely on the chronometer on the primary display. 5 seconds to real space translation. His heart slammed against his ribs, a frantic trapped bird. Sweat beaded on his forehead, cold and slick. He wasn't a soldier. He shouldn't be here. He had begged command to let him stay on Luna to manage the supply lines, but Reed had insisted. "You loaded the guns, Arthur. You need to see them fire. None of us get to wash our hands of this." 3, 2, 1. The universe snapped back into existence with a violent jolt that threw Arthur against his straps. The ship groaned the massive tungsten hull, screaming in protest against the sudden change in physics. Alarms immediately began to blare, bathing the command center in a strobing demonic red light. "Translation complete!" the helmsman shouted over the din. His voice was hoarse, desperate. "We are in the system, staging coordinates Alpha." Arthur unbuckled his restraints, his hands clumsy and shaking. He forced himself to stand his legs, feeling like they were made of water. He stumbled toward the primary tactical display table, gripping the edge to steady himself. "Visual," General Reed barked from the command dais. The main view screen blinked the static clearing to reveal the void. It wasn't empty. Hanging in the blackness of space was a planet. It was massive, a deep, swirling, bruised purple and sickly green. The atmosphere was thick, roiling with violent storm systems. And orbiting that planet, swarming like angry hornets around a kicked nest, was the Reeve fleet. Hundreds of them. The same angular, light-absorbing ships that had blackened the skies of Earth. Telemetry shows massive energy spikes. The tactical officer gasped, wiping his mouth with the back of a trembling hand. "They know we're here. They're charging weapons." "Let them," Reed said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a man who had already accepted his own damnation. "Fleet-wide channel. Open it." Arthur watched the telemetry data flood his screen. The human fleet, 60 blocky, ugly flying anvils, had dropped out of slipspace in a tight wedge formation. They were already moving their massive thrusters, burning blinding white, accelerating straight toward the gravity well of the planet. "This is General Reed to all vessels." Reed's voice echoed through the ship's intercom. "Target locks confirmed. Authorization code Omega-7. Fire." There was no grand speech, no heroic posturing, just a sequence of buttons pressed on cold glass. The dreadnought Wrath shuddered. It wasn't a sharp recoil, It was a deep, seismic rumble that vibrated through the soles of Arthur's boots and rattled his teeth. The lights flickered. The air pressure in the room dropped for a fraction of a second as the massive capacitors discharged. Along the spine of the ship, the magnetic coils of the primary kinetic cannon energized. A slug of solid iron the size of a city bus was accelerated down the barrel to a fraction of the speed of light. Through the viewport, Arthur didn't see a laser beam. He didn't see a glowing torpedo. He saw nothing. The projectile moved too fast for the human eye to track. What he saw was the result. On the tactical display, a Rive cruiser, directly in the path of the slug, simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion. The kinetic energy was so absolute that the alien ship was instantly converted into a cloud of expanding plasma and superheated dust. The slug didn't even slow down. It punched through the wreckage and continued its arc toward the planet below. And then the rest of the human fleet fired. 60 kinetic slugs tore through the void. They ripped through the Rive defensive line like wet tissue paper. The angular, terrifying ships that had brought Earth to its knees were shattered, their debris fields colliding with other ships in a cascading domino effect of catastrophic destruction. But the fleet wasn't aiming for the ships. Arthur watched the main screen as the first wave of iron slugs hit the planet's atmosphere. The friction of entry superheated the air, creating streaks of blinding incandescent fire across the purple sky. When they struck the surface, the tactical display whited out for a full 3 seconds. "Impact," the sensor operator whispered. He sounded like he was praying. Seismic shock waves registering on a global scale, crustal fracturing detected. The visual feed cleared, filtering out the blinding light. Where the slugs had hit the surface of the planet was peeling back. Massive glowing red rings of displaced earth and magma were expanding outward from the impact zones visible from high orbit. The atmosphere was already filling with dust, choking out the green and purple clouds with the angry gray of pulverized rock. It was Denver, multiplied by 10,000. "Reload," Reed ordered. "Realign. Fire." Arthur gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles aching. He couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the invisible weight of what they were doing. He watched the Reeve ship scramble desperately, firing plasma lances at the human fleet. Some found their marks. On the display, the icon for the dreadnought Vanguard flickered and disappeared as a concentrated barrage melted through its tungsten armor. 3,000 human lives snuffed out in a heartbeat. Arthur didn't flinch. The part of his brain that used to care, the part that used to feel horror at the loss of life, was walled off, entombed behind the chalky ash of his memories. The wrath shuddered again. Another iron slug launched. Another city on the planet below was instantly converted into a crater. "We're breaking their tectonic plates," the tactical officer said, his voice rising in panic. "General, the energy readings from the mantle." "I know," Reed said. "Keep firing." Arthur looked at the main screen. The planet below was dying. The atmosphere was boiling away, stripped into space by the sheer kinetic force of the impacts. The surface was a lattice of glowing red cracks, bleeding magma into the void. He had wanted this. Back on Earth, freezing in the ruins, he had wanted revenge. He had wanted them to hurt. But looking at it now, he realized there was no satisfaction in it. There was no triumphant swell of music. There was just the cold, mechanical hum of the deck, plating the smell of sick on the floor, and the horrifying math-driven efficiency of human rage. They weren't heroes fighting monsters. They had simply decided to become a bigger monster. "Major Cole," Reed called out over the blaring alarms. "Status of the secondary magazines." Arthur blinked, pulling his eyes away from the burning world. He looked at his datapad. His hands were perfectly still now. The trembling had stopped. The contradiction of his own soul settled into a numb, freezing clarity. He tapped the screen. "Secondary magazines are primed, General." Arthur replied, his voice entirely dead. "We have enough iron to crack the core." "Then let's finish it," Reed said, "and set a course for the next system." Arthur nodded slowly. He keyed in the release codes for the next volley, feeling the ship groan around him, preparing to deliver another killing blow in the dark. The Wrath smelled like a locker room that had been sealed in a plastic bag and left in the sun. 6 months into the campaign, 4 Reeve worlds reduced to glowing fractured cinders. The initial terrifying silence of the void had been replaced by a constant, inescapable chorus of mechanical failing. The dreadnought was dying. She was a brutalist block of tungsten built in a panic, and the rushed welds were giving way under the repeated stress of slipspace transitions. Arthur sat in the lower engineering bay. The air here was 10 degrees hotter than the command deck, thick with the smell of atomized lubricant and scorched copper wire. He was rubbing a thumb over his bottom teeth. They felt loose in his gums. The synthetic protein paste they had been eating for half a year lacked ascorbic acid. They were developing scurvy in deep space. "I can't give you the coil, Major." Chief Engineer Hayes was a woman who looked like she had been carved out of a root. Her hands were permanently stained black with grease, and she walked with a limp from a blown pressure valve 2 systems back. "I'm not asking Hayes," Arthur said. His voice sounded like sandpaper dragging across wood. He didn't have the energy to raise it. "Sector 4's life support scrubbers are failing. The CO2 levels in the portside barracks are at 4%. Men are waking up with bloody noses and migraines. I need the auxiliary coil to reboot the ventilation." Hayes wiped her forehead with a filthy rag. "And if you take the auxiliary coil from my slip drive manifold, we run a 12% higher risk of a catastrophic translation error on the next jump. Meaning we get turned inside out and smeared across 5 different dimensions. Tell the men to breathe less." Arthur stared at her. He didn't blink. The skin under his eyes was bruised a deep, permanent purple. He slowly lifted his datapad, the blue light harsh against the dim red emergency lighting of the bay. "We are jumping in 18 hours, Arthur stated flatly. "If the men in Sector 4 don't get clean air, they will be too lethargic to load the secondary breech loaders when the autoloaders inevitably jam. If the breech loaders aren't firing, our rate of kinetic output drops by 20%. If our output drops, arrive plasma lance will gut us before we can crack their mantle. Give me the coil." Hayes held his gaze for a long, agonizing moment. The massive deck plates vibrated under their boots as the primary thrusters fired a low subsonic groan that rattled Arthur's loose teeth. "You're a ghoul, Major," Hayes whispered. She turned to her tool bench, grabbing a heavy wrench. She didn't throw it at him, but she slammed it down onto the metal casing of the manifold hard enough to make Arthur flinch. "I'll have it pulled in 10 minutes. Get out of my bay." Arthur turned and walked away. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel anything. He made his way back up the narrow, claustrophobic corridors toward the command deck. The lights flickered constantly now. Every 50 feet he passed crew members. They didn't salute anymore. They just moved out of his way, pressing their backs against the cold metal bulkheads, their eyes hollow and vacant. They looked like ghosts haunting a tomb that was still falling through space. When they had glassed the first planet, there had been a terrifying sort of awe. When they glassed the second, there was a grim, silent satisfaction. By the fourth, it was just a job. A blue-collar manual labor job of exterminating billions. They pulled the levers, they watched the crust crack, they recalibrated the guns, and they moved on. Arthur stopped at a viewport. It was a thick, scratched pane of permaglass looking out into the void. The stars didn't look beautiful anymore. They looked like hostile eyes staring back at the infection spreading through their galaxy. He touched the glass. It was freezing. We are the plague, he thought. The thought didn't carry any guilt. It was just a mathematical reality. The Rive had tried to cut out the tumor, and instead they had metastasized it. Arthur pulled his collar up, shivering, as the chill of the void seeped through the hull, and kept walking. He had a spreadsheet to update. The Rive staging depot hung in the shadow of a massive ringside gas giant. It was a sprawling skeletal structure, heavily damaged by a blind fire kinetic barrage from the human Vanguard ships 3 days prior. It was venting a pale blue gas into the vacuum coolant. Arthur tasted copper. His tongue pressed against the inside of his cheek as the boarding shuttle clamped onto the jagged edge of a blown-out airlock with a violent metal-on-metal screech. "Seal is green," Sergeant Foster muttered over the comms. His voice was staticky degraded by the radiation emitting from the gas giant. "Equalizing pressure, or what's left of it." Arthur stood up in the cramped shuttle cabin. His heavy EVA suit was cumbersome, smelling of old rubber sweat and recycled breath. The joints whined as he moved. He carried a plasma torch in his right hand and a heavy kinetic sidearm on his hip. He wasn't a Marine. He was a quartermaster. But they were desperately low on slip drive calibration matrices, and Arthur was the only one who knew exactly what the Reeve components looked like, having studied the Mariana Trench wrecks back on Earth. The airlock doors ground open. The silence of zero gravity was absolute pressing against Arthur's eardrums until they throbbed. The interior of the Rive station was bathed in the harsh, rotating beams of the shuttle's floodlights. The shadows danced wildly, elongating and contracting against the twisted metal bulkheads. "Spread out," Foster ordered. "Keep your tethers secure. Major, lead the way to engineering." Arthur pulled himself through the threshold. The station didn't have gravity. Floating in the corridors were crystalline shards of shattered consoles, drifting droplets of that pale blue coolant, and other things. Oily black spheres, frozen solid, blood. Arthur pushed off a bulkhead drifting down the hexagonal corridor. The architecture was entirely alien. No right angles. Everything curved organic and flowing like the interior of a massive seashell. It made him nauseous. "Contact," a Marine chimed in. "Dead, drifting in the portside junction." Arthur kicked off a wall, altering his trajectory toward the junction. His boots magnetized to the floor with a heavy clack, arresting his momentum. He finally saw one up close. Before this, the Rive had just been ships, black triangles in the sky. Then they had been planets, glowing spheres on a tactical display. Now it was a body. The Reeve was wearing an environmental suit, but the helmet had been shattered by spalling shrapnel. Arthur shone his helmet light into the ruined face. It was small, pathetically so, no larger than a human child of 12. The bone structure was avian, incredibly fragile and hollow-looking. The skin was a pale, translucent gray, stretched tight over a muzzle that lacked teeth, possessing instead a hardened ridge like a beak. The eyes were massive black and completely empty. Arthur stared at it. The terrible angular black ships that had glassed Earth, the massive plasma lances, the cold mechanical extermination. It had all been piloted by these. They weren't apex predators. They looked like prey. They looked like creatures that had evolved in a terrifying hostile galaxy and had built massive terrifying machines to hide inside, striking out in pure paranoia at anything that might pose a threat. They hadn't attacked Earth out of malice. Arthur realized it with a sudden sinking weight in his gut. They had attacked out of fear. They saw humanity's rapid expansion, our violent history, our crude burning rockets, and they panicked. And they were right, Arthur thought. Look what we became the second they scratched us. Major, Foster's voice broke the static. You finding what you need? Arthur blinked. The sudden wave of empathy, the profound tragic absurdity of it all washed over him, threatening to drown him. He looked at the fragile, shattered alien. He could almost feel a tear prick the corner of his eye. Then he smelled it. He didn't really smell it, of course. He was in a sealed suit, but his brain supplied it. The smell of burning concrete, the smell of ozone, the smell of 8 million people turning into ash in Denver. The memory hijacked his olfactory senses, powerful and absolute. The empathy snapped like a dry twig. Arthur reached out his heavy mechanized glove, gripping the live corpse by the collar of its suit. He roughly shoved the body aside, ignoring the way the frozen fragile neck snapped with a sickening vibration that traveled up his arm. Behind the body was a maintenance panel. I have the panel. Arthur said, his voice cold, devoid of any music or warmth. He ignited the plasma torch. The blinding blue-white flame cut through the alien metal like butter. Securing the matrices, have the shuttle prepped for immediate dust-off. We jump to the capital system tonight. He cut the components out of the bleeding ship, his hands entirely steady. General Order 114. Eyes-only destination. Rive Prime designation. Target. Alpha mission. Parameter. Absolute surface eradication. Return trajectory. NA. The dreadnought Wrath was bleeding. The primary reactor had suffered a microfracture during the last slipspace transition. Invisible, highly charged particles were flooding the lower decks. The engineering crews were wearing heavy lead-lined suits, but it was just a delay tactic. The ship was dying, and she was killing her crew with her. Arthur walked onto the command deck. The air scrubbers were failing again. The room smelled of old sweat vomit and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. The lighting was stuck on a dim blood-red emergency setting, casting deep shadows into the hollowed-out faces of the bridge crew. General Reed was sitting in the command chair. He looked like a corpse that had been hastily propped up. He had lost most of his hair over the last 2 months. His skin was paper-thin, marked with the angry red sores of acute radiation sickness. He breathed in shallow, wet rasps. "Major," Reed croaked, not turning his head. "General," Arthur replied, stepping up to the dais. He handed Reed a physical piece of paper. The data pads had stopped holding a charge 3 days ago. "The fleet is aligned. 28 ships remaining in combat effective status." Reed stared at the paper. His eyes were milky, the capillaries burst and weeping. 28. We left Luna with 60. We have enough mass. Arthur said, his voice a low, soothing monotone. It was the voice of a hospice nurse. The math holds. If all 28 vessels expend their primary and secondary magazines on target Alpha, we will induce a runaway greenhouse effect and fracture the primary tectonic plates. The atmosphere will become a superheated plasma storm within 48 hours. What about the defensive screen? Reed asked, coughing. He held a bloody rag to his mouth. The Rive home fleet. They outnumber us 50-1, Arthur stated. They will destroy the Vanguard within 3 minutes of translation, but they can't stop the slugs once they leave the barrels. We don't need to survive, General. We just need to fire. Reed slowly lowered the rag. He looked at Arthur, really looked at him. Do you remember what Earth looked like, Arthur? Reed whispered. Before, Arthur paused. He closed his eyes. He tried to picture a forest. He tried to picture a blue ocean or a clear sky. But all he saw was a gray expanse of pulverized bone and drywall. All he smelled was the ash. No, sir, Arthur lied. He opened his eyes. I don't, Reed nodded slowly, accepting the lie. Good. Nostalgia is a vulnerability. The general reached forward with a trembling hand and keyed the fleet-wide comms channel. All vessels, this is General Reed. His voice was weak in the room, but over the speakers amplified by the ship's comms, it carried the heavy, terrible weight of a falling executioner's blade. We are at the end of the road. There is no return fuel. There is no extraction plan. When we drop into real space, you will be facing the entirety of the Rive Armada. Ignore them. Let them burn you. You lock your targeting computers onto the planetary mass below, and you empty your magazines. You fire until your barrels melt. You fire until your reactors go critical. Reed paused, taking a rattling breath. They struck Earth first. They thought we would die quietly in the dark. Show them what human grief looks like. Jump in 3, 2, 1. Arthur grabbed the railing of the tactical table. The Wrath screamed as the slip drive engaged, tearing a hole in the fabric of reality. The transition was brutally violent. The ship groaned, bulkheads buckling. Sparks showered from the ceiling as power conduits overloaded. Arthur's vision went entirely white, a crushing pressure, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Then reality snapped back. The tactical display lit up instantly. The screen was a chaotic, blinding mess of red icons. The Rive home fleet was massive, a swarm of black angular ships forming a literal shield around a stunning emerald green planet. Almost immediately, the dark void was illuminated by hundreds of blinding plasma lances striking the human fleet. The ship next to them, the dreadnought Vengeance, took 4 concentrated beams to its midsection. Its reactor breached, and the ship vanished in a silent, expanding sphere of white-hot nuclear fire. Target locks confirmed, the tactical officer screamed, his console throwing sparks. We are painted multiple incoming. Fire. Reed gasped. The Wrath shuddered. The primary kinetic cannon launched. Arthur watched the telemetry. He didn't look at the incoming plasma fire that was melting through their armor plating. He didn't look at the alarms blaring a warning of imminent hull failure. He watched the solid iron slug, the size of a city bus, cross the distance between the ship and the Emerald Planet in a fraction of a second. He watched it punch through the Rive defensive line. He watched it hit the atmosphere. And as the Wrath's armor finally gave way, as the blinding light of a Reeve plasma lance pierced the command deck, Arthur Cole didn't scream. He didn't flinch. He just smiled, a small, terrible smile, as the emerald world below began to bleed fire. The plasma lance did not make a sound when it breached the hull. In the movies, there was always a deafening explosion, a dramatic crescendo of fire and thrown bodies. The reality of a directed energy weapon hitting a depressurizing dreadnought was much more quiet and infinitely more violent. It sounded like a massive intake of breath. A sharp, terrifying hiss as the hyper-pressurized atmosphere of the command deck was instantly superheated and sucked into the vacuum of space. Arthur didn't have time to process the blinding actinic white light that severed the room in half. The kinetic shockwave hit him first. It felt like being struck in the chest with a baseball bat swung by a machine. He was thrown backward, his boots entirely leaving the deck plating. The gravity generators failed a millisecond later, turning his violent trajectory into a helpless floating spin. He slammed back first into a reinforced structural pillar. He heard a wet, loud crack inside his own head, followed instantly by the sickening feeling of his ribs giving way. The pain didn't register immediately. The adrenaline flooding his system acted like a chemical wall, keeping the agony at bay, while his brain scrambled to understand what was happening. The bridge was gone. Half of the command dais, including the chair General Reed had been sitting in, simply did not exist anymore. Where they had been, there was now a jagged, glowing orange maw open to the black void of space. The air was violently venting, tearing data pads, loose wiring, and the remaining crew members out into the darkness. Arthur grabbed the exposed conduit cable with both hands, his muscles screaming. His shoulder dislocated with a dull pop, but he didn't let go. He couldn't feel his fingers. He just clamped his hands into iron hooks and held on as the hurricane of escaping air tried to drag him out. He saw the helmsman, a kid from Chicago, whose name Arthur couldn't even remember, fly past him. The boy's mouth was open in a silent scream, his eyes bulging as the pressure differential boiled the moisture on his corneas. He was sucked through the breach, disappearing into the void like a piece of discarded trash. Emergency bulkheads. Arthur's brain managed to form a single rational thought. The ship's automated survival systems finally kicked in. With a series of heavy percussive thuds that vibrated through the conduit, Arthur was clutching thick slabs of depleted uranium slammed down, sealing off the fractured sections of the command deck. The howling wind stopped instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Arthur let go of the cable. He drifted in the zero gravity, his body rotating slowly. The emergency lighting was dead. The only illumination came from the glowing molten edges of the destroyed consoles and the ambient light of the stars through the remaining intact viewports. He coughed. A fine mist of dark blood sprayed from his lips, hanging in the air before him in perfect floating red spheres. His ribs were definitely broken. Maybe a punctured lung. He fumbled for the collar of his pressure suit, his clumsy numb fingers finding the auto-seal tab. He pulled it. The thin, transparent deployment helmet snapped up from the collar, sealing around his head with a sharp hiss of compressed oxygen. The air tasted stale like rubber and iodine, but it kept his lungs from collapsing. He grabbed a handhold on the wall and pulled himself toward the primary observation blister. His body felt heavy and sluggish despite the lack of gravity. Every movement sent a spike of white-hot agony through his chest. He reached the permaglass window and looked out. The human fleet was dying. It was a slaughter. The Rive defensive perimeter was a hornet's nest of concentrated plasma fire. The dark void was strobing with the violent deaths of dreadnoughts. He watched the Dauntless take a broadside that shattered its spine, the massive ship folding in on itself before its magazines cooked off. He saw the Leviathan venting atmosphere from 100 microscopic railgun punctures spinning out of control. They were dropping like flies. 28 ships reduced to 15, then 10, then 4. But they had already fired. Arthur looked past the dying human fleet, down at the emerald jewel of the Rive homeworld. The iron slugs were hitting. The atmosphere of the planet didn't just part, it ignited. Massive blooming flowers of blinding white light blossomed across the green surface. They were impacts of such kinetic magnitude that the naked eye couldn't comprehend the scale. From high orbit, they looked like flashbulbs. On the ground, they were continent-shattering extinction events. Arthur pressed his helmet against the freezing glass. He watched as the emerald green was violently swallowed by expanding shockwaves of pulverized rock and steam. The oceans were vaporizing, creating massive swirling hurricane systems of superheated gray clouds that wrapped around the globe. Then came the red. Deep glowing cracks appeared across the planetary crust. The tectonic plates shattered by the simultaneous impact of hundreds of relativistic iron slugs were folding over one another. Magma bled up from the mantle painting the dying world in a web of angry glowing fire. The human fleet was gone. The Wrath was nothing more than a drifting tomb, its main power dead, its weapons silenced. But the mission was over. Arthur watched a world die. Billions of lives, alien children, sprawling cities, entire ecosystems, erased in less than 4 minutes. He waited for the triumph. He waited for the vindication. He had spent 14 months freezing on a dead Earth, choking on ash, dreaming of this exact moment. He had meticulously calculated the exact tonnage of iron needed to make it happen. He had starved his own people to build the guns, but as the emerald world turned into a glowing, cracked cinder, Arthur felt nothing but a profound, hollow exhaustion. He slid down the bulkhead, his boots gently touching the deck. He pulled his knees to his chest, wincing as his broken ribs ground together. He rested his head against the cold metal, watching the orange glow of the burning planet reflect in the shattered permaglass. He wasn't a savior. He was an executioner who had just finished a very long, very bloody shift, and there was no one left to pay him. Time lost its architecture. Without the hum of the ship's primary drives, without the artificial day-night cycle of the overhead lights, there was only the slow, agonizing creep of the cold. Arthur remained slumped beneath the observation blister. His suit's internal heaters had failed hours ago, or perhaps days ago. The battery indicator on his wrist display was cracked, leaking a faint toxic-smelling fluid into the lining of his sleeve. He was shivering so violently that his teeth clicked together in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. The temperature in the sealed compartment was dropping toward absolute zero. The moisture from his own breath had frozen against the inside of his faceplate, creating a layer of delicate crystalline frost that obscured his vision. He had to keep blinking away the ice that formed on his eyelashes. He moved his left hand. The joints of the suit protested the rubber, stiff and unforgiving. He pressed his gloved palm against his ribs. The pain was still there, but it had dulled, replaced by a deep, spreading numbness. The human body could only sustain panic for so long before it simply ran out of the chemicals required to care. "System diagnostics," Arthur rasped. His throat was so dry it felt like it was packed with sand. The suit's internal speaker crackled. "Suit integrity compromised. Radiation shielding at 12%. Internal temperature critical. Oxygen reserves 4 hours." The mechanical female voice didn't sound alarmed. It was just reading the ledger. Arthur appreciated that. He always liked ledgers. Numbers didn't judge you. They didn't ask you how you slept at night. They just presented the bill. He scraped a gloved finger against his faceplate, clearing a small circle in the frost. He leaned his head back against the bulkhead and looked out the window. The Rive fleet was still there. There were hundreds of them untouched by the human attack. Their dark, angular hulls blotted out the stars. But they weren't moving. They weren't hunting down the drifting wreckage of the human dreadnoughts. They were paralyzed in a state of collective planetary shock. Below them, their homeworld was a corpse. The atmosphere had completely burned away, leaving a jagged glowing ball of exposed magma and fractured basalt. The gravity well was fluctuating wildly, tearing massive chunks of the crust into low orbit. Arthur watched as a Rive cruiser, caught in the unpredictable gravitational eddies of the dying planet, was slowly dragged downward. It didn't fire its thrusters. It didn't try to escape. The ship simply drifted down into the expanding field of superheated debris, silently disintegrating as it collided with a mountain-sized chunk of its own world. They were mourning. Arthur stared at the alien ships. He tried to project the hate back into his mind. He tried to remember the smell of Denver. He tried to picture Corporal Miller's shaking hands. He tried to conjure the righteous burning fury that had built the wrath. It wouldn't come. The well was completely dry. All he saw out there were orphans. He had made them orphans, and now they were just waiting to die in the cold, completely broken by a grief they had never calculated into their grand, paranoid strategy. They thought we were animals. Arthur thought, his mind sluggish, the thoughts moving like syrup. They thought if they stepped on the nest, the ants would just scatter. He coughed again. More blood. It coated the inside of his helmet visor, freezing instantly into a pink, translucent film. He was dying. The radiation leaking from the Wrath's cracked core was baking his cells even as the vacuum froze his blood. His skin felt like it was covered in a severe sunburn, tight and itching uncontrollably beneath the thick layers of his suit. He needed to leave something behind. It was a primitive urge. The dying animal wanting to mark the tree before the winter took it. He pushed his hands against the deck, plating his muscles, trembling wildly. He forced himself up onto his knees. The universe spun a nauseating tilt of stars and fire. He closed his eyes, waited for the vertigo to pass, and then dragged himself toward the secondary communications console, embedded in the wall near the sealed bulkhead. It was a manual override terminal designed to survive an EMP blast. It looked like a heavy industrial typewriter bolted to the wall. Arthur pulled himself up, using the console for support. His vision was tunneling the edges of his sight, turning a deep, fuzzy gray. He wiped his visor again, smearing the frozen blood. He slammed his fist against the power relay beside the console. Once. Twice. On the third strike, a dim, sickly yellow light flickered to life on the small CRT screen. Text began to scroll white against black. Emergency power online. Uplink status offline. Local network severed. He typed into the heavy mechanical keyboard. His fingers were so numb, he had to look at his hands to make sure he was hitting the right keys. Each press was an agonizing effort. Initialize tachyon burst protocol. Target coordinates Sol system. Earth command. The screen blinked. Calculating trajectory. Warning power reserves insufficient for continuous broadcast. Single burst only. "That's all I need," Arthur whispered to the empty room. He accessed the ship's black box telemetry. It was all there. The navigation logs, the jump coordinates, the weapon discharge reports, and the visual data. The exact spectroscopic analysis of the Reeve homeworld, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the target had been utterly eradicated. He dragged the files into the transmission queue. He stared at the blinking cursor. There was an option to attach a text file. A final message from the front line. What could he possibly say? What were the last words of the man who had done the math to end a species? He thought about General Reed vaporized in his chair. He thought about Chief Engineer Hayes likely suffocated in the lower decks. He thought about the billions of ash shadows painted on the concrete of Earth. His fingers hovered over the keys. He didn't want to write a speech. He didn't want to be remembered as a hero. He just wanted to close the book. He began to type. The manual override terminal was a brutalist piece of engineering designed during the paranoid, frantic early months of the war. It was entirely analog, severed from the ship's primary data net to survive an EMP cascade. It looked less like a computer and more like a heavy industrial loom bolted to the titanium bulkhead. Arthur pulled himself up, wrapping his left arm around a thick bundle of exposed fiber optic cabling to keep himself anchored in the zero gravity. His right hand hovered over the keyboard. The keys were heavy mechanical blocks of tungsten. Depressing one required about 3 pounds of physical pressure. To Arthur, whose body was currently shutting down massive networks of peripheral nerves to keep his core from freezing, it felt like trying to move a mountain. He stared at the small, square CRT monitor. It glowed with a sickly, jaundiced amber light, casting deep, hollow shadows across the frost forming on the inside of his helmet visor. Initialize tachyon burst protocol. The enter key required a brutal strike from the heel of his hand. It snapped down with a loud, percussive clack that vibrated through the freezing rubber of his suit and directly into his fractured ribs. He tasted fresh copper. Another blood vessel had given way in his lungs. The amber screen flickered, struggling to draw current from the dreadnought's dying auxiliary capacitors. Calculating trajectory. Warning power reserves insufficient for continuous broadcast. Single burst only. Uplink standing by. Attach telemetry Y/N. Arthur typed Y. He watched the progress bar inch across the screen. It was all there. The navigation logs. The weapon discharge manifests. The exact, indisputable spectroscopic analysis of the Rive homeworld, documenting the sudden, violent shift from a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere to a superheated sphere of heavy metals and plasma. It was the receipt for an entire species. Telemetry attached. Add textual addendum Y/N. Arthur hesitated. The ambient temperature in the compartment had dropped well below freezing. The sweat that had soaked his undersuit during the plasma lance strike was now a layer of icy grit against his skin. His toes had gone completely numb 20 minutes ago. Now the deadness was creeping past his knees. He hit Y. What were the final words of a man who had engineered an apocalypse? He placed his trembling fingers on the home row. The frost on his visor was getting thicker. He had to scrape the side of his heavy gauntlet against the permaglass just to read the amber text. To Central Command Earth. From Major Arthur Cole, Quartermaster Dreadnought Wrath. He stopped. He imagined the bunker in Geneva, or whatever hole in the ground Central Command was operating out of now. He pictured General Sterling or one of the other brass reading this. They would cheer. Someone would probably cry tears of relief. They would break out whatever hoarded pre-war whiskey they had left. That thought made Arthur's stomach churn with a violent, acidic disgust. He didn't want them to cheer. Target Alpha is neutralized. The math held. Casualties on their side. Total. Casualties on our side. Total. He paused, his breathing shallow and rapid. Each inhale was a razor blade drawn across his chest. He closed his eyes, leaning his helmet against the freezing metal of the terminal casing. He tried to type something noble. He tried to type, "The sacrifice of this fleet ensures humanity's tomorrow." He got as far as the sacrifice before he slammed the backspace key, deleting it. It was a lie. There was nothing noble here. He looked to his left, out the shattered observation blister. The emerald world was gone, replaced by a jagged bleeding sphere of fractured tectonic plates and boiling magma. Around it, the Rev fleet simply drifted, paralyzed by a grief so absolute it had broken their chain of command. They weren't monsters. They were just terrified. And they had been right to be. Arthur's hands returned to the heavy keys. He typed slowly, deliberately, forcing his failing muscles to carve the truth into the ship's final data packet. Do not celebrate this. The attached telemetry confirms planetary fracture. The Rive capacity to wage war project power or sustain industry no longer exists. They are broken. They will not return to our sky. We did exactly what you asked us to do. We burned their house down with them inside it. He paused to cough a wet, heavy sound that sprayed a fine mist of pink blood against the inside of his visor. It immediately froze into a crystalline web. He peered through it, his vision tunneling into a narrow gray vignette. But you need to understand what you are looking at when you review the visual feeds. You are not looking at a victory. You are looking at a mirror. They hit us because they were terrified of what we might become. They looked across the dark and saw a violent, unpredictable species that couldn't even stop killing itself over lines on a map. They tried to put us down before we could reach them, and we proved them right. Arthur's fingers were slipping off the keys. The cold was no longer an agonizing bite. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was pulling him down into the dark. We took the worst parts of ourselves, our cruelty, our spite, our terrifying capacity for industrial slaughter, and we weaponized it. We didn't beat them by being better. We beat them by being exactly the monsters they feared we were. Earth is safe. The sky is yours again. Rebuild the cities. Breathe the air. But when you look up at the stars, do not expect to find friends. Do not expect to find wonder. We have broadcast our nature to the entire galaxy. We have drawn a line in the ash of two worlds. The ledger is balanced, but the cost was our humanity. We are the apex predators now. May God forgive us. Transmission end. Arthur stared at the blinking cursor. He didn't read it over. He didn't have the time. With the last ounce of strength in his right arm, he brought his fist down on the execute key. Deep within the shattered spine of the Wrath, the tachyon array demanded its toll. The terminal screen died instantly, the amber light winking out, plunging the compartment into absolute impenetrable darkness. The deck plates vibrated faintly, a single massive pulse of energy, tearing a microscopic hole in the fabric of space-time, sending the data packet screaming across the void toward the Sol system. Then there was nothing. Arthur's hand slid off the keyboard. He didn't try to anchor himself. He let his body drift backward in the zero gravity, a slow, silent rotation away from the terminal. The shivering finally stopped. It was a well-documented physiological response. The body, realizing the fight was over, simply gave up the ghost. A strange phantom warmth began to bloom in Arthur's chest. It felt like stepping into a heated room after a long walk in the snow. He didn't hear the silence of the ship anymore. He heard the low mechanical groan of a diesel crawler crane. He closed his eyes beneath the frost-covered visor. The orange glow of the dying planet outside faded, replaced by a sky of bruised, sickly purple. He was standing on the jagged lip of the crater. The air tasted like chalk and melted copper. He saw Corporal Miller, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching her data pad. He saw the yellow suits of the cleanup crews crawling over the pulverized concrete. Arthur smiled faintly, his face muscles rigid and stiff. He was finally back in Denver. His lungs stopped pulling for air. His heart, having pushed the last drop of freezing blood through his veins, simply stopped beating. Major Arthur Cole became perfectly still, just another piece of debris floating in the dark, forever tethered to the ash of the worlds he had helped burn. If you felt the chill of the void and the crushing weight of Arthur's final choice, leave a like and let me know in the comments below. Did humanity go too far? Or was the absolute destruction of the Rive the only way to ensure Earth's survival? Sci-fi is about exploring the darkest corners of our nature. And if you want more deeply human, raw, and gritty, HFY stories that don't pull any punches, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans, and I'll see you in the next transmission.